Hi, so today I'm going to be talking about vintage sewing patterns, and this is going to be a three-part kind of mini series where I'll be talking about storing, using and also resizing vintage sewing patterns. And so hopefully this will be useful whether you're someone who's been using vintage patterns for a while and you just want a few extra tips or a reminder, but also particularly if you really want to be using vintage sewing patterns but are still feeling a little bit overwhelmed by everything that's out there and the fact that they are a bit different to modern patterns. So this video is going to be the first of three, as I've said, and this is going to be about storing and also tracing your vintage sewing patterns so that you can keep them in the best condition possible and they will last for a good long time and not degrade on you. So let's go. Number one, most important and easiest thing that you can do when it comes to using your vintage sewing patterns is wash your hands before handling them. Even if you're clean, even if you've just come out of the shower, your hands will contain natural oils which we all produce, and those can slowly degrade paper over time and also textiles if they're left on them. So absolutely number one, wash your hands first. It's super easy and super cheap. So number two is store them as well as you can afford to, and afford to as in how much money you can afford to spend, but also how much space you can afford to devote to your pattern collection. And when I say pattern collection, you don't have to be someone with 50, 100, hundreds of patterns. They could just be like your 5 patterns that you've got, or even just your 1. So this is for everybody, this video. So light, water, pests and acids are what's going to degrade sewing patterns the most when you aren't using them, when they're just sitting in your cupboard or on your shelf. So think about how you can avoid those things when you can. So while you want to keep water and pests out of your patterns, you also don't want them to be sealed up tight, because what this will mean is that water vapour that does get trapped in there, because it's just in the air around us, can't then escape, and it's going to potentially condense, which is going to cause mould or damp damage over time. So acid-free is the gold standard for paper preservation as far as my knowledge goes. Little caveat which I maybe should have put at the beginning, I'm not a conservationist, a professional in any way about conservation. This is just what I've picked up from my research and from a little bit of the time I have spent working in museum collections. So acid-free is fairly widely available for boxes and plastic wallets and things like that, but it does tend to be a bit more expensive, mostly because you have to get it, you'll probably have to get it from some kind of preservation or conservation supplies place, rather than the average cardboard box that you could get from just your local shop. So what do I use? I use comic book storage, which is something that has sort of been floating around for a long time as an option for sewing pattern storage, both vintage and modern. What I really like about it is that comic book collectors are also quite keen about looking after and preserving their paper-based collections, and the supplies that they have are available in quite a range of sizes, including ones that work quite well for sewing patterns. So what do I use? I use comic book storage, which is something that has kind of been around in the sewing communities for a little bit of time as an option for sewing storage, and I found it really works for me. So one thing that's really great is that it's an easy place to find a lot of different sizes and kinds of storage solutions that are acid-free or in other ways designed for paper preservation, because of course comic book collectors are also keen to take care of and look after their paper-based collections. So I chose to use these plastic sleeves and cardboard inserts. So I use the plastic sleeve obviously just to keep the pattern protected, but what I think is really the lifesaver of it is this cardboard insert, and I'd highly recommend getting something like this that does a similar job whatever your system is going to be, because what it means is that no matter where you're storing your pattern, they're so much less likely to get kind of smushed up, and by that point it's gotten really quite damaged. And so I really love these for that. It helps them stand up, so it makes them really easy to stack in a shelf, and also it makes them all the same size, which makes it easier to pick, you know, boxes and shelf sizes and things like that if you've got a lot of patterns to store. I went for this size, which is a bit bigger than A4, because then I knew it would fit pretty much all of my patterns. Most of mine are kind of more the standard size, like these ones, which I've already got in here. So it also just leaves you with plenty of space to have the pattern pieces separate. So making some attempt at good storage is better than nothing. So really don't be put off if you're starting to look up options and feel like it's too expensive or you just don't have the space for those options. Choose the one that you can afford and that you can fit into whatever space you're working with. Figure out what you can manage and pull in the advice that I'm giving and that you can find elsewhere to try and keep out things like light, dust, pests and damp from your patterns. But as I say, something is better than nothing. So number 2 is treat them gently, and this is going to come up again and again because paper patterns, whilst first and foremost a practical item which often take a bit of a beating when they're being used, are also quite delicate, even new ones, you know, so you've got to be careful with them anyway. And once they're older, they can often be brittle or have existing tears and damage that you don't want to make worse. So because of this, you really want to look out for areas of weakness. Like I mentioned, tears, but also folds can weaken the sort of structural integrity of the paper and become a vulnerable place for tears to happen. So really avoid creating new ones when you're putting your patterns away. When you are putting them away, I really strongly recommend not putting them back in the original envelope. This is because it's really hard to do anyway with modern patterns. You'll normally end up kind of ripping the envelope, tearing it in some way because it actually just won't fit, and your tissue pieces tend to get all crumpled and smushed up when you do. Instead, keep them separately, but if you want, in the same wallet like I do. Ideally, you probably would keep your tissue pieces and your envelope and your instructions all in a separate wallet, just so they're not going to be rubbing off ink or any other kind of contaminants they may have on them onto each other. I don't do that because I don't have the space for doing that and I don't have the funds for buying that many plastic wallets, but if you can, it is a good option. Most of all though, do not put things back in the envelope. You can just keep them all loose behind the envelope like I do with my patterns as separate pieces. And this also means you haven't got to be trying to fold your tissue up into really tiny pieces to get back into that envelope. So sometimes with old patterns, and I really love this, you will unwrap them, unpack them and find there's still some old pins holding together alterations to the original tissue paper. And I love this as a really poignant reminder that these are things that women and men have been using for decades and decades and adapting them to their bodies that whole time. You know, no one has ever been, it's never been the case where the whole population fit the standard mould of society. And so people have always had to adapt their patterns, they've always had to resize them. Even when they're from that time period. So don't feel put off by that, and if you find pins in a pattern, it can be a really nice reminder of that. However, pins sitting in a pattern, as you may notice, often start to rust and cause damage to the pattern. And they're also, of course, something sharp and abrasive that's then going to be around the pattern pieces and could damage your pattern and also you if you stabbed yourself on an old rusty pin. That's probably not going to be great. So best practice is to remove those pins, smooth out the folds, because the holes they leave behind also might be quite delicate too. However, if you think of those pins as a really lovely reminder of the lived experiences and part of the history that comes with your pattern, I think that is a valid reason to leave them in there. Sometimes those sorts of things get left in historical objects because they remind us of the stories that these objects hold, rather than the entire focus being on how can we make this object perfect or back to its original state again. We accept the story of that life that the object has lived. And so if you want to do that, I say do that. It's completely up to you. It's your pattern, it's your choice. The next thing I'm going to be talking about is how to use your pattern, not in terms of all the instructions and what they all mean, but actually the pattern pieces and how to kind of treat them and handle them for the sake of preservation. So 100% I recommend that you should be tracing your original vintage patterns. This means that you have something that is a much sturdier copy of the pattern, so you can do things like alterations, you can fold it up, you haven't got to worry about it whilst you're using it. And it means that if you're going to be using it over and over, you're not constantly getting those delicate pieces of tissue paper in and out of the packet and potentially damaging them. If you're really keen to look after your patterns and you're willing to put the effort in, it can also be a good idea to scan or just photograph the instructions and even the cover sheet and the back of the envelope, so that again you don't have to get them in and out every single time you want to check them and every time you want to make that pattern again. So if you are going to trace it, or if you're going to I admit sometimes, like me, use it directly with your fabric. This is where we come to treat your things gently part 2. When you are tracing or just using your pattern with fabric, really bear in mind its delicacy again. Don't use pins to attach your fabric, to attach the pattern to your fabric or to your tracing paper. This is obviously just going to create holes and is going to cause additional damage or make points of weakness where tears could happen again. Pattern weights are much preferable. They're a much better choice as they're not going to create holes that will weaken or tear, and they also really help with getting your pattern laid out flat. So when you're unfolding your pattern pieces, do so really carefully. Be mindful of where the folds might have become entangled or kind of wrapped around each other. This can happen quite often, I've found, when you're unfolding pattern pieces. Don't rush this because you will probably end up tearing it by accident. It has happened to me before. Instead, take it slow and try to gently tease out any bits that they've gotten tangled up or crumpled. To flatten your piece out once you have managed to unfold it, first just really gently smooth it out with your hands, bearing in mind to not put too much pressure on or you could kind of pull it and again cause tears. Then, this is where your pattern weights come in really handy. Ideally, I think you want to use quite light ones in this case because the tissue paper isn't particularly heavy and the folds aren't super strong. And if you use a really heavy piece and use this technique I'm going to mention, it can sort of cause drag and risk tearing it. So I just use these washers from the DIY store. It's nothing fancy, but if you've got nice ones, that's great. So starting in the middle of the pattern, in kind of the biggest fold, if there is one there, you want to start to smooth your pattern outwards with your weight. So yeah, I start with the biggest folds and then work my way out to the smallest. And you may need to repeat the smoothing a few times to really flatten it out. And you can just see how you just kind of want to work your way over the folds to get them nice and smooth. So you can use an iron to deal with really stubborn folds or crinkles in a sewing pattern. I really prefer not to. I do worry a bit about damaging them even just from the heat, kind of weakening them. But you can do it if you've got something that's been really badly crinkled up. Just if you do, make sure you start on the absolute lowest heat, that you empty out all the water from your iron and have any steam settings or spray settings turned off because you really don't want to be getting the paper wet. And then just start on a low heat, and if you need to turn it up, just do it incrementally to make sure you're not going to scorch your pattern pieces. So the next thing that's really important is use pencil or chalk when you're tracing around the tissue paper pattern. These are much more removable, much less permanent, and much less damaging just in themselves than ink is going to be. Even if you have those disappearing pens, it's still ink. Ink often contains acids, which, like we've already mentioned, can eat away at and damage paper over time. So use a pencil or use chalk if you're going onto fabric. And so my last point is kind of going to be maybe you should have traced it off as well, because if you're doing things like alterations to your pattern, if you need to lengthen or shorten, which the vintage patterns do sometimes have, you know, indications for lengthen or shorten here, the standard practice of that is to cut across those lines or fold across those lines. But obviously that's going to really damage your pattern, and so you really don't want to be doing that. And there are ways of doing that with the tissue pattern without damaging it. You can just sort of shift it up or down instead of folding or cutting in order to take or add that length, but it can be a little bit of a pain and a bit difficult if you've got a really big pattern piece. So if you think you're going to be needing to make adjustments to your pattern, I would recommend tracing it especially so. So that is all for this video, some tips on storing and using your patterns. Some of it might seem kind of obvious, but I think it's worth reiterating things like just, you know, be gentle, be careful. Like I said, I'm not a professional paper conservationist or anything like that, but I do have some experience with working with patterns and with kind of old objects in general. If you do have any other tips or any specific kind of conservation knowledge, please do leave them in the comments. I'd love to know. If you have any corrections on what I've said, something that actually isn't very good advice, please say so, because I want to make sure that no one's going to go and do something that's going to put their patterns at risk. And I really hope that this has helped you get a bit of confidence with using your patterns or going out and getting some patterns to use, because personally I love working with vintage patterns. So yeah, join me again at some point, hopefully fairly soon, for the next part in this mini series, which is going to be about actually using your patterns and how to kind of understand some of the sewing instructions and symbols that you find on vintage sewing patterns. But you can do it if you really hate folds in your pattern, or you've got something that's been really badly crinkled.